Hi everybody, it's meteorologist Joe Cioffi. It's Friday, February 23rd, 2018, 6 o'clock Eastern Time. And I have to tell you, so much going on. I'm not even sure exactly what to start with. Do we start with the current weather? Do you start with the watches and warnings that are up now? Do we start with the severe weather that might occur tomorrow in the areas from northeast Texas into the Ohio Valley and across parts of the Gulf states? Do we start with what could be a record-breaking blocking pattern that is setting up for next week? I mean, I forgot. I don't even want to leave out this. Do we start with Europe, which is going to be experiencing not only extreme cold conditions, but at least from the standpoint of the GFS model, it keeps making quite a snow event for parts of, for the UK, for England, for Ireland, for Scotland, and for parts of Western Europe later next week. So this is busy. Okay, at the very least, it's busy. So I tell you what, let's start with right now, and we'll bring up the watches and warnings that are up at the moment, because the U.S. map, and think back over stretches over the last couple of months where we had hardly anything going on. It's lit up kind of like a Christmas tree today on both coasts and even in the middle. And we've got some winter weather advisories this evening over parts of the Northeast for some freezing rain. Flood watches from east central Pennsylvania down through the southern half of Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, into most of western Kentucky, westernmost Tennessee, all of Arkansas, into the northwest corner of Louisiana, back through northeast Texas and east Oklahoma. We have winter weather advisories up for a good chunk of Kansas, Nebraska, eastern South Dakota, most of western Iowa and northern Missouri. Winter storm warnings up for southern Minnesota on northward up into northeastern Minnesota, northwestern Wisconsin, and we've got some winter storm watches that extend from there into the western areas of the upper peninsula of Michigan. Out in the west, a smattering of winter weather advisories and a few winter storm warnings here and there from the Rockies west up to the Pacific Northwest coast. Some hard freezes for Southern California. There's been a blizzard warning up for these two counties in Montana for the last 2.5 days, it seems. And there are some winter weather advisories and winter storm watches extending a little bit further to the east from there. So that kind of takes care of what's happening in the short term. Let's bring up for tomorrow the threat for severe weather, because we do have a strong storm that is going to develop and move out of the Central Plains and head up into the western Great Lakes. So the Storm Prediction Center has an enhanced risk of severe weather for Saturday, a large area of marginal, you have the area of marginal risk, but that's a pretty big area for this time of year. An enhanced risk of severe weather from extreme northeastern Texas through most of Arkansas, western Tennessee, northwestern Mississippi, into western Kentucky, and just touching southern Illinois and southernmost Indiana, and a larger area of light risk on the slight risk on the outside of that, and then the marginal risk outside of that, and a general threat of thunderstorms pointing all the way up into the Ohio Valley. So we're getting into that time of year where severe weather is going to be a player, and we're going to have to start paying attention. So before we go to the long range, let's go through what's going to happen this weekend. And a lot of just a crazy day here, folks, with all this weather going on. It's just nuts. But no matter. So we're going to start with this current system here. You've got snow coming into the Pacific Northwest. And by the way, I'm going to just check really fast, because I'm noticing it's not often that you have they don't have advisories up for the coast, but I just want to check. I always like to check Seattle's forecast here, and they've actually are forecasting. Oh, let's see. Are they giving? Yeah, they're forecasting a little less than an inch of snow for Seattle. They're outside of the winter weather advisory, so they're going for basically a coating to an inch for Tacoma, Seattle, and Everett, Washington, with winter weather advisories in the higher elevations to the east of them. And in some of the mountains, they're forecasting 1 to 2 feet in places. Mount Baker, Stevens Pass, and down into Paradise in Washington State. I don't know how high that is. They're forecasting 24 inches forecast to accumulate. So very active there up in the northwest. We are going to see a low pressure. You can see it coming out of here across Kansas. This is for tomorrow afternoon into tomorrow night. There's this area of precip that the GFS has matching up with that severe weather. And where you see the yellow and the red, it actually, the GFS kind of would suggest that perhaps the severe weather risk, the risk for the strongest storms might be a little bit further to the north than where SPC has it at the moment. It's not to say the GFS is right. I'm just kind of pointing out the differences between the two. And then you notice the snow for eastern Nebraska up through western Iowa and in through Minnesota as that low really starts to intensify. Although the model has backed off a little bit in terms of the strength. It had it in the 980s yesterday, now in 994. But it eventually does get into the 980s once it moves up into the upper peninsula of Michigan. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, certainly going to see winter storm warnings go up. They already have. You might see those expanded a little bit. And there might be the odd blizzard warning or two as well. More moisture coming into the northwest. This is into Sunday. Now, at this point in the east, we've got this warm front, big high sitting northeast of New Brunswick, and you've got a warm front that's kind of pinched down to the south of me across Delaware and on up the mid-Atlantic coast. At high pressing down, might keep the flow a bit onshore-ish for a while, but it does get it through. And you can see some snow and ice throughout parts of central and northern New England. Looks like Maine, interior Maine, gets saved for a little while. And then this all moves away to the northeast, and we get into some calm weather for a few days next week. Out in the west early next week, you've got a low that's dropping down into southern Nevada and into the southwest. And that energy starts to translate eastward. Now, here's where, with the models now, as we start to go look to see what it's going to do in the long range. And, I'm going to stop it here at Wednesday of next week because this is where the blocking signature is going to become front and center for the weather in the United States and across actually pretty much all of North America. Let me just show you what's happening here. And I have been told by a few people that are looking at some of these indices, and particularly the NAO and how it crashes completely off the wall or did on the overnight runs, that if that verifies, this could be the strongest block ever observed for this time of year. Now think about this. We just had a few days ago what could be the strongest ridge along the East Coast we've ever seen for this time of year. And now a week later, we've been talking about that rubber band snapping and snapping back hard. Here we're going to be now a week later, and we're going to have the strongest blocking high signature that we've ever seen in the Atlantic for late February, early March. And you can see how it evolves, how this upper high just basically moves over Greenland and then moves down in its way to eastern Canada. Now, I want to point out, again, and this is really important, every run of the model is, because of the extreme nature of this, every single run of the model is handling things differently. I just went back the GFS from 6 hours earlier, from earlier today, and I'm just going to back it up to the end of the week. The blocking signature on the GFS is different on that run. It was different on the run before, and it's different on the latest run. I just want to also show you the differences between this and the European and the Canadian. The European and Canadian have an even stronger signature of this upper high, and doesn't mean it's right, but it's in that ballpark of possibilities here. It has a much stronger upper high. This is the Canadian model. And when we look at the European model, the European has the strongest blocking signature of all three. It's got this upper high. You can see it's all higher than normal heights and pressures all through Canada and on up through the polar regions. The entire jet stream is shifted well to the south so that you have below normal heights, below normal pressures across the United States. So basically everywhere south of 45 degrees north is below average in terms of the flow, the jet stream flow, the heights, how we measure how high in the atmosphere you have to go to get a 500 millibar pressure. Well, you don't have to go very high if you're anywhere between 30 north and 50 north. The jet is just very, very strong, and as a result, you've got things that are moving that normally in areas that move from west to east are actually going to be moving from east to west. And of course, as this energy comes out of the Pacific, and you can watch this here, as this energy swings out of the Pacific, it's going to react to that block, and how it reacts to the block, how strong is the block. Bear in mind, if the block is too strong, everything gets suppressed way to the south. Also, there's a question, if you look out in the Atlantic from, actually if you start looking back here, I'll go back one where you have this energy in the coming down out of the Great Lakes. There's an upper low that's sitting out near 40 and 60, and then you have this big storm that's out near the Azores. Well, there's only so much room, and if you're going to have this kind of hanging around out in the Atlantic, an argument could be made certainly that this system may wind up getting shoved to the south and east, and you can see how kind of strung out all of this is. This is a forecast dilemma. This is a problem, and this is something that could very well be in the realm of possibilities. If the block is too weak, as the GFS suggests, it actually wants to take this system, and instead of shoving it to the south, it leaves room for it to move further north, and has more of the energy in the north there. And you can see there's a cutoff low in the Gulf of Maine for about the same time that the European has it much further to the south, and the Canadian has it much further south. And then after that, there are more implications with all this, because there's more energy coming out of the west. You're seeing the ridge in the west finally appearing for a little while anyway, before another trough magically appears towards the end of the period. Whether that's there or not remains to be seen. But the bottom line is, folks, that we are going to be in a really, really fluid situation from run to run for the next week or so as this block takes hold. And there's really no way to know how this is all going to wind up at this point. But you know, windows of opportunity are there. Here's I'm going to go look at the European. I want to show you what the European did today. And then, speaking of European, we're going to go look at Europe. But here's how the European treats that upper low at the end of next week as it shoves it southeastward. Here's what the surface looks like with this. Okay, so you've got a low in central Michigan that's a primary that's dying out, and we have a strong secondary that's, the model shows, off the Virginia coast. There's high pressure at the surface up through all of eastern Canada, back up and through central Canada, so there's an argument to be made as to some colder air draining down. We'll have to wait and see when we get there how real that is. But ultimately, because of the fact that in the Europeans' case the block is so strong and so huge in its scope, and it is pretty far to the south, this low doesn't lift up. It actually gets suppressed to the east-southeast. That's unusual. That is a very unusual scenario. But you know, we're seeing the strongest block that we may see the strongest block we've ever seen for this time of year. And we just saw what happened with that strong upper high, with all-time record high temperatures being broken in a number of places. We may see some unusual things here over the next couple of weeks as this block develops. So those of you who had doubts about this block happening, you're running out of time. Remember that just because you have it is no guarantee that something is going to happen that you might like. The block you want and the block you get may be two different things. Now here's the European model, and I'm going to back it. I'm going to just start from, well, might as well start from the beginning actually. I'll show you the temperature anomalies. We'll go even back a couple of days. So we're actually back to Tuesday, and you can watch the cold air, some cold air that's already in now, but the main sweep there in the bright purples, that's Saturday. We're actually going to see above average temperatures across the UK for Saturday and into northern France, but you can say goodbye to that by the time you get to later Sunday and Monday, as that bitter cold from Siberia just spreads westward all the way westward past the British Isles and out into the Atlantic. And the models are showing, the GFS in particular, showing a rather interesting storm. It's been showing it run after run. This is the surface map for Monday. You can see low pressure east of Portugal there, which really doesn't do very much. But then you have a stronger low that comes out on Thursday east of France, and you've got a kind of a little wrapped up little low there sitting in the English Channel with yet another low near Portugal that moves northeastward into France. It's fairly deep. This is for next weekend, and then northeastward from there. I'm going to bring the GFS up now, and I'll put the precip because we can at least look at that, and we'll go backwards. GFS actually has, similar idea, and, bear in mind, folks, those of you watching from Europe and from the UK, I don't have a lot of forecasting experience here, so I have actually a minimal amount. It's what I've been learning over the last number of months since we had Hurricane Ophelia. But you're going to have those easterlies off the North Sea. That's going to create some snow, I think, early beginning, probably as early as Monday and into Tuesday. And then here comes that low, and that moves up much like what the European has into the English Channel, and then just kind of sits there and rotates around for a day or two. It just takes about 2 days for it to get out of the way, and then there's yet another series of lows that come up after that. The model, the GFS anyway, is very bullish on snow amounts here over the next 10 days throughout all of Europe. I mean, it really goes hog wild in England, northern England, and through eastern Scotland. You're talking some pretty hefty amounts here on the scale, on the order of 30 centimeters or more. Even into Ireland, a good chunk of Ireland getting in the order of 25 to 30 centimeters over the next 10 days, if that happens. Less as you go to the south, of course, but throughout France, much of Italy, down into northern Spain. It's loaded. It's just an absolutely loaded pattern. Now, in the U.S., why don't we look at the U.S. snowfall over the next 10 days? The European model, which I can't really show you, probably has double what the GFS model has in the West. Okay, this is the 10-day snowfall, and the European actually has double this. It has virtually all of the West getting clobbered with snow. A lot of that having to do with that deep trough that we have, at least initially. But as far as the storm goes in the upper Midwest, we can at least take a look at what it's doing with that. So here we have, these are the snowfall amounts for the low that's coming through now. It's actually backed off from prior runs. Looks like it has a general 4 to 8 inch snowfall, so it's giving less. Now, it does swing more snow here later next week, but that's because it takes that next low and tries to track it toward the Great Lakes. I don't know if that's correct. The European model has a much further south track with all that. So the blocking pattern would suggest that the tracks should be further south and not further north. I've seen stranger things happen, though, so I'm not going to rule anything completely out, but just bear in mind that models are going to be in an extremely volatile position over the next number of days. Look at these teleconnections, by the way, which I have not brought up yet. It's going to bring those up now. But these were off last night's 0Z ensembles. And the NAO, and right now that PNA, that Pacific North America Index, continues to be an off-the-wall negative territory, but it does spike up, starts to accelerate upward to the neutral line by about March 6th. The NAO just absolutely crashes to a record negative reading toward the end of next week, and then starts a rapid climb, but it never really quite gets to the neutral line. But I've been kind of focusing on the 5 to the dates, say from the 5th to the 8th time frame, for something to happen as well, and that's going to be at the point where you see these indices spike up. The models are going to try something at the end of next week, at the point where the NAO is at its absolute lowest. So that is one time frame we're going to consider. But at the point where you've got this PNA spiking up and the NAO climbing up through negative territory and trying to get back up into only slightly negative territory, that is around March, say around March 6th, March 7th time frame. So that's another date that you want to look at. Now, among the other variables that we're going to have to deal with is how much cold air is going to be around in the east, and that, at a time of year where that becomes questionable, because we're going into March, and that's just the way it works. We'll take a look at the anomalies, because I think they're probably more important than the actual temperatures, at least initially. And we're going to have to be a little careful here, because we don't really know how the setups are. If the GFS has this low tracking much further to the north, then yeah, you're going to have a warm front, cold front setup there, so it won't be that particularly cold. The GFS anomalies are going to match what it does. Now, if we go with the European, and actually the Canadian is also colder, so we can look at the Canadian model. Near average temperatures, you've got this kind of expanding area of below average once you go south of New York City and on up toward the mid-Atlantic coast. That would be where you're, because of the jet stream being suppressed as far south as it is, that's where you're going to see your highest level of below normal temperatures. With the blocking signature, you are going to have above average temperatures up to the north in Canada. That's just how it works. And when you look at you can see where at least the nighttime temperatures, where the freezing line is, it does get down pretty far to the south into northern Georgia and in through the interior Carolinas and Pennsylvania. It's a little bit more questionable near the coast, but you really aren't going to know how cold the low levels of the atmosphere will be until we have a clear view of what exactly we're dealing with. How much of the high to the north is going to press down? How much of that cold air is going to press down? It's been my experience in situations like this that models underdo the amount of cold air, and also because of the dynamics in the upper atmosphere, there will be what I often refer to as do-it-yourself cold air, where the storms themselves, the upper features, the cold upper low, if it's as intense as if it gets very intense, basically winds up manufacturing its own cold air. But that is a short-range forecast problem. That is not a problem that you can really handle or tackle 7 days out. So I think it's pretty clear that we've got a pretty exciting pattern ahead to look forward to, and we're going to have a lot of fun watching all this evolve. And you young forecasters that are watching, pay very close attention to something, to what's been happening right now and what's happening next week, because these are things that will come back from time to time in your future when you deal with these kinds of situations next year, 2 years from now, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. So right now, Dio Nankumar pointing out the Euro model's not been any good this winter. The blocking signatures, I think, throw all the models into question here. So I would look very, very carefully over the coming days regarding that. Because I don't think any of the models are really going to be able to handle, what the blocking means in the short term and in the medium term, and watch for models to try to break that blocking down too quickly, because that's another thing that happens. Models like to get rid of it fast, and sometimes that doesn't quite happen that way. So you're going to have to be very, very careful. I would also, shy away at this point. Shy away at this point from making, really broad general statements about the weather ahead because you feel something. All right. I would just suggest that we're seeing something here that's a bit unprecedented. So we might have some outcomes that that we're not sure of. Okay. You might wind up seeing things that you may not expect. So let's just let them all play out. I think that's the best approach. Watch these things with a very open mind as they develop. Tom Adams, you're on this score thing. Again, can we just kind of stop it at this point? I don't really want to get into it anymore. I've had enough. So anyway, let's see. Everybody always going back to certain storms. This might be a whole different scenario. It's not off. I can't. It's hard for me to recall with respect to blocking patterns. When the last time we had something like this in late February, early March. The blocking signature has been virtually non-existent in the Atlantic since 2010, 2011. So it's been almost 7 years. We've had occasional appearances of negative NAOs, but none of them have lasted more than a week or so. And this one is the first time that I've seen the NAO go off the wall in a winter or early spring, a late fall, winter, or early spring month. So this way we'll cover areas from November to March. This is the first time I think that I've seen that. You may have to go back to 2010, 2011. That's an awfully long time to go without a blocking of any magnitude, let alone what we're seeing here. So it's going to be, like I said, Anthony Orr, would it be fair to say if this blocking happened in January, February timeframe, it would be a different story given the time of year? Now we're getting later and later. Well, it depends, Anthony. Yes and no. It's hard to say sometimes because you go back, if you go back to some years where the NAO, back way in the 70s, there were years where the NAO was a big player in the wintertime, but because of other things, it didn't necessarily, and it was negative throughout January and February, but it didn't necessarily play out the way you might think it could play out. There were a number of Decembers that I remember in the 70s where the NAO was negative for the whole month, but there was no cold air to speak of throughout the eastern part of the United States in some of those years. And you wound up with a lot of nor'easters, but they were basically all rain everywhere. So we'll see. This time of year, they all have, you have to kind of deal with what's in front of you when they're happening. So you could have the signature in January and February and not necessarily come out with the outcome you would think. Let's see. Blocking in 2011 is when New York City missed out on the snowpocalypse. As I remember, Jason, though, the 2010-2011 winter did produce a lot of snow. It just shut off early. If I recall, when we got into the end of January, beginning of February, there was very little snow after that. That was, I believe, a front-end loaded winter. Does I-95 get too warm by March for all-time record snows? Inland areas have gotten their biggest snows in March. Well, Joshua, I will say you're going to need a perfect setup. I mean, no question you're going to need a perfect setup. Just the right amount of cold air. You're going to need a perfect track, perfect everything. I don't think it's impossible, though. The Ash Wednesday storm of 1962 would argue that. So we're just going to have to wait to see it all set up, and at that point, we will we'll know better. But you know what? You start to get a little deeper in the month of March, and then it becomes problematic. I think once you pass the first 10 days of March, to get a snowstorm in the a 10-inch plus snowstorm in the I-95 corridor becomes difficult. Even last year, it looked like it would happen, and it just missed south and east of 95. But north and west, I mean, literally along and north and west of 95, they got it. But south and east of 95, no. From New Jersey on up through up and through upstate New York and through into New England, and you didn't have to go that far. But every one of them, rather than make general statements, I just think it's a better idea to deal with the forecast that's at hand and deal with what's in front of you, and then go from there. I'm actually going to be pretty interested to see what happens in Europe over the next 5 or 6 days. That's got my interest really peaked here with that cold air coming in from the east, from Siberia, and the storminess that's coming in from off the Atlantic at the same time. So we're going to keep an eye on that right here on this YouTube channel over the weekend. So be sure to tune in. In the meantime, I'm going to call it a night at this point. You guys all have a great weekend. We'll be live streaming this weekend at some point, so check the channel. I'll schedule a time. It's always a little problematic on the weekends because I got stuff I want to do, and I want to take a little bit of a break as well. So, but if I had to guess, probably sometime in the evening would be the best bet, especially on Sunday. Okay, so everybody have a great Friday night. On Facebook tonight, 9:15. It's the Joe and Joe Show. So if you want to go through this again, tune in on my Facebook page at 9:15. Meteorologist Joe Cioffi. You can link to that right from the channel page. There's a link on the top, and we'll see you either later or tomorrow.